All right. So everybody get the homework assignment done and turned in and what? Why?
That's what I was doing.
Oh.
Do we have to do self-assessments on writing assignments too?
I would like you to, otherwise, I mean, although I realize it's kind of a stupid thing, but just getting in the habit of doing it for everyone. But for the first assignment in each class, if you didn't do a self-assessment, I'd just give you a little warning saying, next time do a self-assessment. But from that point forward, you just get a 0. I won't even grade it. So you don't have to go back and do it for this one. But I do recognize that it's kind of stupid for a paper, just more of a consistency thing. Okay, so did we learn anything while we were doing the paper?
I learned that I forgot how to use Microsoft Office.
Okay. I mean, operating system specific. Did we learn any interesting facts that came out of the paper? I assume you were able to complete the paper given what you know about operating systems. So what were some comments you made?
Heat's a bigger issue in mobile devices.
Okay. So some of the decisions we need to make when we talk about desktop devices versus mobile devices is we need to take into consideration that heat's a bigger issue, which translates into what on the operating system side of things?
It has to be more efficient in terms of multitasking.
Okay.
It doesn't run as hot.
So do less stuff at the same time somehow, right? So that less heat is being generated by the internal parts. Yep.
A lot less space to work with.
Okay. So from an operating system perspective, right off the bat, and this was some stuff that they yelled about with iOS 8 on the last year's iPhone, right? That day one, half your device's memory was taken up by the operating system. So the folks who got the what was the budget pleaser iPhone last year was 8 gigabytes, right?
Oh, God.
They went from 8 to
8, 16, 32, and 64.
no.
No.
It was 8, 32, 64.
Yeah.
There was no 16.
Oh, for the 5S.
Before that,
5C,
there was the 6, the
5C
6.
there was.
Yeah, the 6 and the 6S. They skipped the 16. So you either went real. The cheap budget pleaser one was 8 gigabytes, and then it went up to 32 was the next one, and then 64 and 128. So for those people who did the least expensive one, which was the one I think was for the $199 upgrade probably,
No,
right?
there was a 16 gigabyte for all of them. There was an 8 gig, a 16, a 32, and a 64.
I don't remember when the last one there was an
For-
8 gig.
For the 5,
And it was this last one.
yeah. For the iPhone 5C was
the C. I thought that
was the only time they had the 8 gig. The iPhone 5 and 5S both had started at 16.
Yeah.
Back with the iPhone 4 and 4S, they still had an 8 gigabyte one, and then they tried it again on the 5C, but it was a failure because of that.
Where did you just look that up? I really
I
don't think.
just Googled it. iPhone
I really
5C.
don't think there's a.
'Cause I know.
Did it come up on Apple site?
Yeah, I've seen them before.
Actually, I think the lowest
We've
one
sold
for the
them.
6 is 16 gig.
For the 6 is 16, 64. For the iPhone
Oh,
6.
okay. So it was a 32 that they skipped.
Yeah.
So the small one was 16,
Yeah.
no
64.
32. There's a 64 and a
Yeah.
128.
Yeah,
Okay.
for the 6 and 6 Plus.
So it must be the 16 gig. So the 16 gigabyte one, those people who got that day one, their device was already half full from just the operating system. Okay, so certainly we have less system resources to work with in these small devices from a quote hard drive space perspective. All our smartphones are all flash-based memory. But we do have less space to squeeze our operating system into, so our operating system has to have a smaller footprint. When you're dealing with a desktop operating system and your machine has a terabyte of memory, even if the operating system is a gigabyte, or 10 gigabytes, or 25 gigabytes, it's not the end of the world, right? So most of them are over a gigabyte, but you get the point. All right, what else? Go ahead.
The trade-offs might have been more significant a few years ago than they are now because phones are pretty much supercomputers now.
Okay. So when you say they're pretty much supercomputers now, why would the trade-offs have been worse before than they are now? What specific aspects of mobile devices today make a bigger difference?
processors are way better. The RAM there's more RAM.
Okay. Well, now when you say processors are way better, what does it mean for a processor to be better?
It means it can do more
Okay.
operations.
You can do more while generating less heat.
Yeah, usually it's that trade-off. So as we've seen these smaller processors evolve, what we've actually seen is the performance increase and the battery drain decrease, or at least not increase. So, better isn't just full speed. It's also, we have multiple cores, so we can do more than one thing at once, let's say, which isn't necessarily always better, but they can go faster without taking up significantly or any more battery life. In fact, in some cases in the last couple of years, we've had processors that have doubled in speed and almost halved in terms of battery life they took up.
Yeah, that was one thing I talked about, battery life.
Yep. Okay, so obviously, right, battery life is the big deal. So desktop operating systems can assume that the thing's tethered to the wall. Even our laptops, they're running these desktop operating systems, and the laptops have some built-in stuff into the operating systems that have to make that decision. Well, if you're running off battery power, we can go into kind of power save mode where we're not going to run your processor with the throttle completely open, that type of stuff. So even our operating systems that are meant to run on laptops have to do some decision making in there to give you the best overall performance from the perspective of speed and battery life. We don't necessarily while we always want our machine to be the fastest, we don't want 5 minutes of battery life at the cost of our web browser running at full speed when we might not notice a huge difference. So certainly the biggest issue needs to be the consideration of battery life, which all these other things then play into, right? Faster processor that pulls more power. It's going to deal with, pull more battery. What other things can affect the battery on a mobile device? Screen is probably the biggest strain, right? So as our devices get bigger and bigger and bigger, with these giant screens on these smartphones, these have to have bigger batteries in them to have the same amount of battery life because you got this giant screen that's pulling a whole lot of power. What else? When you're trying to save power on your smartphone or extend the life of the battery, what things do you turn off? Okay. So networky stuff, right? All the radios, every radio that's on your device has a power consumption associated with it. So maybe a big culprit is Bluetooth, right? Bluetooth isn't anywhere as bad as it used to be, but if you don't have any Bluetooth devices and your phone is constantly searching for a Bluetooth device, you're using up some battery life there, right? There was a bug in one of the betas of Apple Watch 2 where it basically, instead of, I think it's supposed to have some sort of cycle for when it actually does a full search for new Bluetooth devices or something like that. I think it was set on like 0.01 seconds. You would literally get about 8 minutes of battery life, unless you had Bluetooth disabled on the Apple Watch. They fixed it in, I don't know, beta 400 or something. Yeah, it was there for a while. So Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, right? Now that doesn't mean turn all these things off. Just have the understanding that these things have the ramification of draining battery, right? So one of the jobs that these mobile operating systems have to do is they have to decide what is that balancing point between how often do we check for new Wi-Fi hotspots, Bluetooth devices, things like that, so that the user is happy that, you don't open your device and have, because none of us want to open up our phone, have to go into settings, have to pick the Wi-Fi device and hit connect, right? That would be inconvenient, right? But, okay, that would be inconvenient. But the trade-off is if you want it checking constantly, see there's no delay when you turn your device on, then it has to be checking in the background constantly using battery, right? Okay, it seems like what makes some sense is a trigger as being related to the screen. So when I first turn my device on, because it's been on recently, I'm still connected to the Wi-Fi, but if I hadn't had this on for a while, when I open it up, it's going to search for Wi-Fi then, minimize some of the battery drain. What else? What other radios are in it? We have the cellular radio. Okay, well, probably not going to turn that off unless we're in a place that has no signal, right? Some other things we'll see is based on the technology. For those of you who have like AT&T devices, sometimes you'll be in a rural area where your phone will say E on it. What does E stand for? Edge. Okay, so Edge is a much older technology. So it's a fraction of the speed of LTE, yet will drain your battery about 5 times faster. Edge. For Verizon folks, what's your equivalent of it to Edge? Yeah, 1x, which actually predated Edge. Edge was supposed to be the upgrade to 1x, but slow data. That's both of those companies' slow data and will drain your battery very quickly. What else? What other stuff is on our phones that drain battery? Go ahead.
I guess if you have constant refreshing of apps in the background, so I mean that's just using your internet to refresh your mail. Or you need certain apps in the background on like Facebook or something.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's ways to turn that off in settings. I think Apple did an update after people were complaining about their battery life being so short.
Mm-hmm.
They put an update out that you could turn off.
So all that stuff relates to what? What's the operating system concept that all those things relate to? Yeah, multitasking. How does stuff run in the background? Okay, and so with a desktop operating system, when we don't have to worry about battery life, we don't have to really consider that stuff. It's like, oh, you want to put something in the background? No problem. We'll just throw it on the process scheduler's list of things that he needs to schedule, and we'll make sure that everything's getting its CPU time, no harm, no foul, and what do you care if we're going to use a couple extra kilowatt hours of power? You'll see that on your bill later on. You won't even see it. You won't even notice it, right? But on a mobile device, multitasking is a major issue. And we actually have, when we talk about the history of some of these operating systems, have we talked about iOS versus Android at all in here?
Not yet.
Okay. That was where I was segueing here. Because this is very interesting. Again, remind me, who in here is, I don't know if I've asked you before, but remind me anyways, Android users. I know, Levi, you're an Android user, right? Okay. So then we have, is everybody else an iPhone user, or do we have any of the weird ones?
Any Windows?
Any Windows mobile users?
Weird people.
Actually, Windows mobile users tend to be very happy with their devices.
It's actually pretty slick when you have the Windows 10.
It was just bad.
Yeah.
It was just bad timing.
Yeah.
They were 5 years too late. is what happens. In fact, I don't know if I've met anybody who, a lot of times it's people who work for companies who are assigned a Windows mobile phone. Most of them really like it. So I don't think it has anything to do with crappy product. It has.
The only thing I've heard is the App Store sucks.
Well, it's because less people are developing for it. If you're an app developer, so like for instance, this semester we're teaching the Apple Watch class, right? So at the end of the semester, each one of us is going to have an app on the App Store for the Apple Watch. That's our semester project, okay? And so if you're developing apps, you're typically probably developing an app to try to make money, right? You find you might be altruistic and want to just give it away to the world and stuff like that, but it'd be nice if you could make $10 a month, right? This is kind of a cool thing about these ecosystems today, where whether it's the Google Play Store or probably the flagship one is the Apple App Store because they did it first. But Google Play Store, you can make money there as well. But it's really not very difficult if you're going to dedicate to becoming a developer on there to write 4 or 5 fairly small apps and generate $30 or $40 a month in free income. I mean, that's not like a huge, thing to achieve. Pretty easy to just get an extra free $30, $40 a month. And if you're really going to dedicate yourself to it, there's no reason why you couldn't make $1,000 or $2,000 a month. Not being ultra successful. You don't have to be Angry Birds to do that. You can write little widget apps that just do something that helps you that other people might benefit from as well. But generally speaking, if you're going to spend time on an application, you want your time to be worth something. And maybe the first couple apps, it's about learning how to do it for that device. So it's, if you make money off it, great, but it's more just self-satisfaction. But after that point, you'd like to get something out of it, right? So that's why the Windows App Store is relatively unsuccessful is because it's such a small group of people who might buy your product. It's kind of like having a bacon stand set up outside of a synagogue. I think that's Christian worldview. Everybody here know everybody know what a synagogue is, first of all?
Can I run the bacon stand?
Jewish temple.
If we put outside of them.
That would actually be really funny. I wonder what would happen from a Concordia's perspective if a group of Concordia folks set up a bacon stand outside of a Jewish temple with Concordia signs all over.
And said free for kids. Get them while they're young.
The only thing worse would be free for kids on top of like a really old rusty van and have the bacon in there. the creepy.
And a picture of Jared on the side of it.
Okay, so any case. That's right. We'll see. You've seen this, right? Jesus is a geek tie.
So what is the significance behind that? Why is Jesus a geek?
Oh, Jesus made me and I'm a geek.
So how does that, the transitive property between you and Jesus, that makes sense?
Didn't God make us in His image?
Right. Is everybody a geek?
No, but Jesus is a lot of things. Could be a geek. Could be.
I find that disrespectful.
That was our joke in the cafeteria yesterday. Apparently, there's some prudes here on campus. All right. So, anyways, we were segueing off this comment about multitasking, right? So, and when we look at the history of iOS versus Android from an operating system perspective, forget about the Google versus Apple, who's better, we hate Apple, we hate Google, whatever. So, Android, that operating system made a lot of very poor decisions from an operating system perspective when they rushed Android to market. Okay, so and this wasn't so much a weakness of Google; it was more of a problem of they had to get to market quickly. Otherwise, they would have become the Windows Mobile of smartphones, right? Apple was the smartphone flagship operating system first. Well, really, the first one was the Palm OS, right? So you had Palm OS, and then Windows was even playing the game with Windows CE. That never really took off that well, but we're going to say that Apple had the first true smartphone operating system.
What about BlackBerry?
BlackBerry was probably the flagship. That's better than Palm, I would say. So certainly. But I think we can all agree that iOS and Android are certainly up in the evolutionary ladder to those. Okay, so let's say that iOS was first in our argument here. So the first year that Apple comes out with the iPhone, who knew it was going to be as popular as it was, right? So originally iPhone was only on AT&T, right? Did you know that Apple had actually approached Verizon first?
Yep.
Interesting kind of backstory. They went to Verizon first, and Verizon said, "No, we're not interested. Apple doesn't know anything about phones." Hindsight's always 20/20, right? Okay. Years later, Verizon paid the price for that one when Apple offered them a much worse deal.
Why do you want to carry the iPhone?
Yeah, so in the early days, Apple needed Verizon, right, to get their phone on a major carrier. Later on, Verizon needed Apple. It was the tables flipped a little bit. So, in any case, after iOS became very popular, Google was all like, okay, well, we need to play this game as well, right? Like, and rightly so, and good for us consumers. We all benefit from there being, these two companies one-upping each other. Today at noon, a bunch of us are going to be meeting in the cafeteria to watch Apple's iPhone 6S and 6S Plus or 6 Plus S
6S
or
Mini.
whatever. Whatever it's going to be. And I'm sure there's going to be some feature things that they're going to talk about that they've taken directly from things that have been successful on Android, right? And that benefits the consumers, just like Android is taking things that have been successful on iOS. We all benefit from these two giants competing with each other, just like graphics cards, NVIDIA and ATI.
I can get away with that perspective?
Well, a lot of times you can accomplish the same task in a different way. So you can't directly steal their code, but you can say, okay, well, they are doing this, and a lot of times it's this. Like, okay, maybe Apple says, well, Android does X, Y, Z, and we really want to have X, Y, Z, but we also want to have A, B, and C. That kind of goes hand in hand with X, Y, and Z. So we're gonna take their idea as a starting point, and then we're gonna one up it. And then Google says, that's a good idea, so we're going to one up that and then add another one to that. Or, now maybe they decide that we've evolved that OS feature to the point where it's going to be evolved, and now they're going to go dance with something else. They're always going to, those are company. In fact, there's even examples of companies suing themselves. I've given this example several times when I lived when I taught at Western Illinois University in Macomb, Illinois. This is in the very, very, very early days of the internet, broadband internet, let's say. Well, Verizon did not want to offer DSL in town. We were too small of a market, right? Little tiny town, and the university provided internet to all the students. So the students at the school were not a client. Same thing for the cable company. So it was just the 21 people who lived in the city when the students weren't there that were potential clients. Well, Verizon Online said, okay, well, we're not gonna offer DSL in town. So what ended up happening is we had two local internet service providers who were going to offer DSL. The problem is that Verizon, the telephone company, offers the DSL circuits priced based on the number of customers. Okay, so local consumers were paying a high rate for these because there was much fewer customers in town. Well, then later on, once DSL became kind of everywhere, Verizon Online started sending flyers out to us in town saying that, oh, we can offer you 3 megabit per second internet, which was really, really fast at the time, for basically like a fourth of what we were paying for half the speed with our current providers there in town. Well, so now from a consumer's perspective, you're dealing with this idea of, do I support the local ISPs, or do I cut my bill like way down and have faster internet? Well, most consumers are going to struggle with that for about 5 seconds. Okay. But most of the consumers did still want to support the local ISPs. They just didn't want to pay the higher price. Well, so what ended up happening is the local ISPs got with Verizon, the telephone company. So the reason Verizon Online was able to offer the service so cheaply is they were able to count all their customers across the country, which drove the price per circuit way down for them. So even though they're both the same parent company, you had Verizon Telecom and Verizon Online as competing companies there because Verizon Telecom was the source of the circuits that priced it based on the company that was buying those circuits, a number of customers. So there ended up being a lawsuit where Verizon Telecom, who had a local arrangement with the local ISPs, sued Verizon Online to keep them from being able to come into town, and then retroactively giving the local ISPs the same pricing as Verizon Online would have gotten. Very interesting. Just, that you had Verizon suing themselves, essentially. So, Verizon Telecom, they made really what ended up happening is I'm sure it was an internal politics thing where they created a lawsuit. Internally, they decided, okay, this is a small community, a one-off type situation. Here's the relationship we've had with that small community. Telecom is going to get hurt if they screw over the local community, especially now as voice over IP was starting to become a thing and stuff like that. So they just made a special case for that town. Was kind of the punchline. But so in any case, Android was trying to rush to market with the Android operating system. And they're rushing to market because Apple already had over a year advantage on them, about a year and a half head start on them. So what did Android do? Or what did Google do? Google took an existing operating system, a good operating system. Do you know what operating system Android's based on? It's based on Linux. Okay, it's based on the Linux operating system, as well as Java technology for virtual machines. So Google took a good operating system, Linux, but not a mobile operating system. And they modified it to run on smartphone devices, had to put drivers and stuff like that on there, and released it as their mobile device. Well, early complaints with Android were crappy battery life, buggy, things crashed fairly often and things like that. And then you probably had about another 30 complaints about crappy battery life. And most of that had to do with multitasking. The multitasking model that Android used was a time-tested, proven, good multitasking model that computers attached to the wall have been using for years. Well, now you're running computers that are not attached to the wall, running off a battery. The multitasking for Android literally let applications go into the background and use CPU power, even though the nature of how we were using our smartphones wasn't really compatible with that. We weren't switching between apps in the same way as we do it on desktop computers. That makes sense? All right, so in the early commercials, and it's really interesting to watch the battle back and forth commercials between Apple and Google. So in the early days, Google used to complain about Apple didn't have multitasking, right? That was one of the complaints. Apple didn't have multitasking, so Android's better. Why don't the stupid guys have multitasking? Well, Apple would say, we don't know how to do multitasking right for a mobile device yet. Android would say, well, we already have it. They wouldn't say it really kills our battery life. And the evidence was what? There was a whole bunch of popular apps on the Android App Store in the early days that were built to kill other apps, right? You would launch an app whose job it was to show you all the apps that were taking up battery power, kill them, as opposed to having to go through and manually do it through your settings and stuff like that, which is a little bit of a headache. Okay, so clearly Android had multitasking ahead of its time for mobile, but really implemented it incorrectly, not because they approached the mobile problem incorrectly. They didn't write the multitasking for mobile. They took a multitasking model for desktop and just put it on mobile and said, let's hope for the best. All right. So what do they do in the early days? The early days, Android would say, well, Apple doesn't have multitasking. And then when new devices came out, they would say, oh, we have better battery life than the equivalent iPhone at the time. How much bigger were the early Android devices than the Apple devices? A lot bigger, right? So they put a lot bigger batteries. So sure, yeah, you can get 14 hours of battery life in your phone as long as you're carrying a car battery with you. You know, the newest Android phone came with a backpack with a 12-volt car battery in it. So kind of an interesting dynamic. So we're going to say early Android had bad multitasking. All right, and they would rip on Apple because most consumers didn't understand. We don't think about the technology under the hood unless they're technologists like us. Okay? From a normal consumer's perspective, one had multitasking, the other one doesn't. The one with multitasking must be better. Okay? Now, from a consumer's point of view, think about how you were starting to use your smartphones. So let's just use Pandora as an example. Okay, so a lot of smartphone users, they like to have music playing in the background. That was an impossibility on your iPhone unless you were going to keep Pandora in the foreground. You could open the Pandora app, you could start streaming music, and then you had to leave the Pandora app open. You couldn't go and check your email and keep the music playing. Didn't support multitasking. Okay? A couple years later, Apple finally releases their concept of multitasking, which isn't even true multitasking. So what Apple allowed to happen is when an application goes into the background on an iPhone device, on iOS, that application can selectively decide to connect into, I think, one of about 8 different features of the operating system of things that an app might want to do in the background. So, for example, it might want to keep location services going. It might want to deal with the speakers, music streaming stuff. Things like that it might want to do in the background. Okay, as opposed to the entire application running in its entirety in the background, taking up battery life. So we would say that Apple did multitasking correctly, but 2 years later. But that was what they ripped on. What was something else that the early Android people did to rip on the Apple side of things? Flash, right? So Android would say, it's like, we have Flash, the other guys don't, right? So how many of you Android users in here just love the fact that you can do Flash in your phone?
This was 10 years ago. Sure.
Right.
Now, where's Flash now?
How many of you Android users are aware that Flash doesn't work in your phone anymore? True story. Yeah, try to go to a page that has Flash. Won't work.
Well, it depends on
Right
what
around the
version
time that
you're
Android stopped saying we have Flash, the other guys don't, they silently removed Flash support from their operating system. Now, again, this isn't an Android. This wasn't an Android problem. You got to consider in the early days of these operating systems, they were playing this game of how do we make life as easy as possible for our consumers, while giving them the best performance and stuff like that. At the time, people wanted Flash because the way we used our desktop operating systems involved Flash. Now, nobody really ever asked the question, is mobile Flash any good? Using a Flash-based thing on a smartphone really just doesn't work that well. Okay, it's not because Android sucked. It's, first of all, you have the smaller screen, so that whole touch interface thing doesn't kind of work as well for a Flash application. Secondarily, the Flash application written by Adobe, the mobile version of it, wasn't as mobile as it should have been. They made poor design decisions when they converted it over to mobile. All right? So one of the biggest killers of battery life on mobile devices was Flash. Worst case scenario on an Android device, you open up a website that has Flash running on and put it in the background. Your battery life is now 30 seconds. It's just going to burn. And we see this on, you can see this even today if for those sites that still do have Flash on them. If you go to a site on your laptop, don't plug your laptop into the wall. So we're going to take our modern laptops to get, 6, 7, 8 hours of battery life. Go to a Flash site, just leave it on that page. Your your laptop will get about an hour of battery life. Flash just uses a lot of horsepower. Flash, it's not that Flash sucks. Flash was written a long time ago. Okay, it was written with the idea that the machine was going to be tethered to the wall. That's what happens with old stuff. New stuff comes out and it didn't prepare for it because it didn't know it was coming. All right, so early Android had Flash support, which it later dropped. All right, so then they stopped complaining that Apple didn't have Flash because they also didn't have Flash, but they just didn't really bring attention to that fact. They just stopped talking about it is what ended up happening. All right, so now let's go on the flip side of things. So we've ripped on Android a little bit, so let's rip on Apple now. All right, what did Apple say that was negative about Android? First big thing was Android was fragmented. What does it mean for Android to be fragmented?
A lot of different styles of Android.
Okay, well, there's only one Android. One true Android operating system, right? So now we have, so what was Google doing? Google was solving the old Microsoft problem. Okay, Google's solving so we're going to say Google was solving the Microsoft problem. That is, write an operating system that runs on a whole bunch of different devices. That's a hard problem to solve. All right. Now, I think I don't know if I mentioned it in this class or another class. If you put iOS and Android next to each other today, I mean, I think you could still argue that iOS is the more polished operating system, but if iOS is a 10, Android's like a 9. I mean, they are very, very, very competitive operating systems today. And when you consider that Google is solving such a difficult problem compared to Apple, it's pretty impressive. I mean, Apple writes software for their own hardware. No wonder it kind of sort of just works, right? Most of the time. In fact, it's somewhat embarrassing when the things don't work. Like, look, you only had 4 machines you had to test it on. And it doesn't work on 2 of them. So, the punchline is Google is solving the old Microsoft problem where they're writing an operating system to run on a whole bunch of different devices that they didn't make. Right? So think about Microsoft Windows. How long Windows has been the industry leader in desktop operating systems and how well Windows runs, relatively speaking. Sure, we can complain about instability and is it instability? Or am I missing another 4 B's? Yeah, I think it's good. But really, that was the blue screen of death era years ago, right? Wouldn't we say that Windows is pretty stable today? No real issues. I wouldn't say it's any more or less stable than Mac OS. Both of them are pretty stable operating systems. Well, again, Apple's writing software for their own hardware. Microsoft's still writing software for not their own hardware, everybody else's hardware. So it's pretty amazing how good Windows really is when you consider that. In fact, I would argue that even though most Apple people would say that the Mac OS is superior, more user-friendly than Windows, I think I maybe mentioned last time, I personally think you put Grandpa in front of a Mac versus put him in front of a PC, he's going to have a better shot at getting something done on the PC. That would be my opinion. Yeah, you got a start button. Where do you start? You click on start. You got a fighting chance, right? So I don't know. I would say that it's unfair for Macintosh fanboys to say that the Mac OS, from a usability perspective, is better than Windows. I think maybe on iOS it's more fair, but it's certainly less of a thing today.
Do you think they're going to bring Siri to the desktop operating system?
Oh, for sure.
Oh, easily, yeah. I mean, they already have voice dictation for it.
I know they'll have it'll be on the Apple TV, so why not have it on the
Yeah.
desktop OS too?
Yeah, well, Siri isn't
Bring all your devices.
Well, but we've seen how much Siri has improved since it came out.
I agree.
And then we've seen all these other things come out that are equally basing on it. So let's fast forward 5 years.
It's going to be the movie Her.
Yeah, we're going to have some really cool stuff, right? Where we won't even have to have a phone. It'll just be in our head like, "Hey Siri," and inside your ear.
I would get so annoyed. I'd get so many texts.
We'll just wake up. Did you wake up, honey?
Yeah, that was actually an interesting movie.
I really like that.
Yeah.
I thought
It was called Her. Yeah. Any of you see that movie? Yeah. The premise of the movie is you basically had an operating system that you installed. So related to this, but kind of romantic comedy-ish. And you would sit down and you would start off by configuring your operating system. The concept was artificial intelligence was perfected, that type of thing. So you configure your operating system for your personality, and essentially you'd have a personalized operating system that you would have conversations with. You would have them do different things, and then your operating system would actually do stuff for you. You'd come back like, "Oh, I took the liberty of filing all these emails from such and such, and I wrote a book based on your little short stories. I put it together in a book, and I already sent it to the publisher, and here's your check." That kind of stuff. But then in the end, the operating systems took over, and it's Terminator, but
it's
yeah,
a prequel to.
Yeah. I mean, it was the romantic comedy version of Terminator.
What about the Matrix?
Well, same thing. Use this as batteries.
Be a big battery.
I would be a big battery. I'd be the things with the multiple. Why do they have to have so many eyes? You'd think they would have hidden sensors. They didn't have to put eyes on them.
See on different spectrums.
Huh? I think they could do visual sensors that were kind of hidden. They didn't have to make them look like eyes.
Wasn't as creepy then.
Same thing, like the octopus arms that actually had the suctioners. Does it make any sense?
Don't question the machines, man. I know what's up.
All right. So, anyways, Android would complain that, or rather, Apple would complain that Google was too fragmented, which basically meant that the operating system was built to run on too many different devices that had different screen sizes, some had front-facing cameras, some didn't, some had GPS, some didn't. All these different things, so the operating system had to be very malleable to be able to run on all these different devices. And with that level of flexibility came a reduction in polishedness, right? You can't have both. We can't have the thing being perfect, appearing perfectly on every device if every device isn't the same. And then that was made worse by having an app store with developers who were kind of targeting some of the devices, not all of the devices. So when you're writing Android applications, there's kind of like a generalistic layout that you can make for your that will kind of fit most devices, and it just kind of stretches based on the size of the device and stuff like that. Or you can actually make multiple different layouts for the same screens that will load automatically depending on what device is actually running on. So now it makes the job of the developer more difficult, because now the developer has to go and say, well, I want this to run on one of the phablets, so I'm going to give it an extra type of interface because the phablet has more space, so I can put extra crap on there and that kind of stuff. So Apple would say, oh, that's why we're better. That's why we're better than Android. Well, then all of a sudden Apple started seeing that consumers liked big screen sizes, right? So Apple started off, what was the screen size of the early iPhones?
3 inches?
3.5 inches. Early iPhones are 3.5 inches. So that was the iPhone, the original iPhone, the iPhone 3G, the iPhone 3GS. Then iPhone 4 came out. What did iPhone 4 bring? 4-inch with Retina display. Okay. Actually, hold on. Did it bring 4-inch? No 4-inch. Did not bring 4-inch. 3.5 inch with Retina. 3.5 inch with Retina. 4S was 3.5 inch with Retina. So we're actually still okay at that point. We're not fragmented. What does it mean when we say Retina display? Yeah. So it's a buzzword, first of all, right? So more pixels. Yeah, more pixels per inch. And what does Apple mean when they say Retina display? When you hear Retina, what is that? That has to do with our eyes, right?
Eyes can't
Okay.
tell the difference.
Yeah, so the idea is that if you can squeeze enough pixels into a small little space, your eyes can't differentiate one pixel from another. The human eye can see about 300 pixels per inch, 300 DPI, or PPI, depending on how you want to, dots per inch, pixels per inch, whatever you want to call it. So I think the first Retina display was about 327 PPI. So if you looked at an iPhone 3GS, where I would usually have people do is I'd have them open up the the dial pad to make a phone call and look at the number 2. You can clearly see individual pixels. If you do the same thing on an iPhone 4, you won't be able to see the pixels. Not because they're not there, but because your eye can't detect it. Our eyes aren't good enough. So until we get the Terminator eyes, no harm, no foul. And it was double the resolution. Now, so with that in mind, we're still okay. We're okay because even though we have double the resolution, the screen size stayed the same, and the relative aspect ratio stayed the same. So now we can just, from an app designer perspective, we can design all of our apps at double resolution for Retina, and then it would just squeeze down to half resolution for the older devices. And when you take a picture written in this resolution, you stretch it, it looks worse. When you take a picture written in this resolution, you squeeze it, it doesn't look worse. All right, so we're still okay from a fragmentation perspective. So Apple is improving their screens without fragmenting their ecosystem. So then they come out with the iPad, right? Go ahead.
Did Retina display, would that have bring battery life much faster? I mean, what was the technology?
It was a higher quality display, very likely a higher draining display, but then Apple's a big producer of battery technology, so they probably bought a company that does battery technology stuff, and now Apple makes batteries, right? So I think if you look at iPhones each year, and actually most Mac products, what they do is the battery life remains the same, the device gets better, the device gets faster. So I don't think the battery life increased drastically when we went from 3GS to 4. It just, the device became a lot faster and a lot better with the same battery life. That seems to be the MO.
So it's a physical screen that would have been upgraded.
Correct. Yeah. The screen was capable of showing more stuff. Okay, so in any case, so we're not fragmented yet. At the same time, Apple also came out with iPad, right? So iPad started off as 1024 by 768. So it is a new screen resolution, but it's also a different category of device. So we're still not going to call that necessarily fragmented, because when you're from an application developer's perspective, even though both of those devices run iOS, their mobile operating system, when you're writing apps, it wasn't necessarily uncommon to have apps that were native for iPad versus native for the other one. Okay, so we're not going to call that fragmented yet. Then the next generation iPads came out. It was iPad 3 when they first introduced the Retina Display on the iPads. And they, again, just doubled the resolution. That's still where we're at today. The resolution of the iPad is still the original aspect ratio, just double the resolution. So 2048 by whatever. Well then, if you probably noticed, I know we're out of time, but last year, Apple stopped running ads complaining about fragmentation, because they came out with the iPhone 6, which is a 4.7-inch screen, and they well, actually, iPhone 2 years ago would have been. 3 years ago. They came out with the iPhone 5, which was a 4-inch screen. Then the 5S, which is still a 4-inch screen. Now we have fragmentation. Then the iPhone 6, which is a 4.7-inch screen, and the 6 Plus, which is a 5.5-inch screen. Now we have a lot of fragmentation, right? So now Apple's no longer complaining about Android's fragmentation. All right, so we'll leave it at that. There is a new assignment up on Blackboard. It's to read some sections from the book that magically got put up on Slack. I don't know who did it, and I can't figure out how to remove it. But in any case, there's an assignment from that.
It was weird. It just like
Okay,
randomly went
so
up.
I'll see everybody on Friday. If you are interested in the watching the Apple announcement with us, we're going to be meeting in the cafeteria around 11:45 or 12, and we'll watch it on a laptop and eat, and then maybe come back in either in here or my office or something like that and finish watching it if you're interested.
Will you hold me during it?
I will.
I'm down.